So welcome everyone to today's book launch, Reimagining the Educated Citizen, Creole Pedagogies in the Transatlantic World, 1685 to 1896 by Petra Hendry. My name is Ying, instructor of Kwantlen Polytechnic University. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples. I will be the chair for today's session, and I would like to thank Dr. William Pinar from UBC to host today's book launch for us. As for the format of today's book launch, we will have 1 hour or so for this session, and the author has around 20 to 30 minutes to introduce her new book to us, followed by a panel discussion. Hopefully, we will have a brief Q&A section from others in attendance. So I hope now to introduce our author today, Petra Hendry. Dr. Petra Hendry is a distinguished professor emeritus at Louisiana State University, where she directed the curriculum theory project as well as the program in women's and gender studies. Dr. Hendry is the author of Engendering Curriculum History, and now of the much anticipated Reimagining the Educated Citizen, published by the prestigious University of Michigan Press. And we will have 3 panelists today. McCarthy from University of Illinois, Nicholas Ng-A-Fook from University of Ottawa, and Elizabeth Clark Neidenbach from Historic New Orleans Collection. So now I want to welcome Dr. Hendry to give us an introduction to her new book.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon to engage in dialogue and conversation about what has been my passion, at least for the last 15 years. And I want to just give a special thanks to Bill Pinar for organizing the event and for his ongoing support and critique of my work over the last 30 plus years. We spent many lunches and conversations going over ideas that have shaped my work and I think made it more critical in many ways. I'm also very deeply grateful to Cameron and Nicholas and Libby for their generosity in contributing to the discussion today. Each in their own way have also shaped this book. So it's an honor to engage with you. I'm going to start off by just sharing one of the many stories or narratives from the book to illustrate the complex processes of creolization that resist sort of normative readings of the history of American education or U.S. education. Then I'm going to provide just a brief overview of the chapters to illustrate the scope of what I call a long history of education. So I'm going to begin with the story of Marie Turpin. So I'm going to start with the story of Marie Turpin. After several weeks traveling down the Mississippi River from Kaskaskia, just south of present-day St. Louis, in the upper Louisiana Territory in the latter part of 1747, Marie Turpin, age 18, born of a French father and an Illinois Catholic convert mother, arrived in New Orleans, where she entered the Ursuline Convent School. As a fee-paying boarding student with a desire to become a professed nun. Ursuline nuns had arrived as missionaries in New Orleans from France in 1727 with the express purpose of converting and educating indigenous women and girls. Marie was not the only student born of a French indigenous marriage at the school. Her niece, Marianne Chauvin, the daughter of one of Louisiana's first founding French families, and his wife, an Illinois convert, also went to the Ursuline school. Their presence at the convent not only signified the Ursulines' commitment to educate all girls and women, regardless of race, class, or ethnicity, but also the desire of the Illinois to expand their social organization trade networks by building relationships through intermarriage, adoption, and fictive kinship, which is how they understood baptism. Marie, a devout Catholic, French speaker, and already literate, was older than most of the boarding students who had entered at a much earlier age. Her French father, Louis, recently widowed, was deeply devoted to his daughter and had been reluctant to let her leave home. Given that she had never experienced convent life, he encouraged her to first become a student before making her profession, hopeful that she would perhaps change her mind and return to Kaskaskia. However, in July of 1749, after 14 months as a student, Marie formally requested that she be allowed to begin her novitiate. She was not deterred by the fact that she would not have the full rank of a choir nun, but instead would be a converse or a domestic nun, carrying out the duties of cooking, nursing, or sewing. While neither wealth, race, or education excluded her from becoming a full nun, it was most likely her social status as the daughter of a royal storekeeper that restricted her access. Marie took her final vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty in 1751, being transformed into Sister Saint Martha, and served as a nun until her death in 1761. As the first Creole nun, meaning that she was born in colonial New France, not France itself, her story exemplifies not only the early history of education in Louisiana, but the complex processes of creolization that shaped her decision to become a nun. Marie was born in 1729 in Kaskaskia, in what is now the state of Illinois. She entered a rapidly changing and complex world. The upper Mississippi Valley at this time was dominated by the Illini Confederation. For over 100 years, the 12 to 13 tribes of the Confederacy had garnered power by controlling this middle ground that linked the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Great Plains. The Illinois prospered, building a strong and complex network of cities. Growing up in Kaskaskia, Marie was part of a multicultural, multilingual community that reflected an increasingly hybrid Creole world. The Jesuits, who had arrived among the Illinois in the 1670s, had developed the mission of the Immaculate Conception in Kaskaskia in 1703 as part of their vision of developing a multicultural, universal Catholicism that they hoped would unite all people in a common humanity. By the time Marie was born, the Jesuits had already lived among the Illini for 30 years, learning their language, studying their culture, writing a catechism in the Illinois language, and of course, hoping for the conversion of Illinois souls. Being raised a Catholic, Marie attended daily Mass at the Immaculate Conception Church, just steps away from her home, which was a 3-story stone house with a gallery, stone chimneys, and shingled roof. Walking to church, she joined not only other Illinois as well as French settlers, but also the enslaved Africans, who made up about 25% of the population in Kaskaskia and who were forced to labor on the Jesuit plantation, and on Sundays also received educational instruction through catechism classes. Hers was a dynamic, cosmopolitan, complex world in which Indigenous, French, and African cultural exchanges shaped everyday life and processes of creolization. While the Illinois appropriated Catholicism in multiple ways to serve their own needs, they resisted learning French. So Marie sang hymns and heard sermons that were translated by the Jesuits into her native Anishinaabe language. Her education was entrusted to Father Boulanger, one of the many Jesuit priests who established mission schools as part of the vast network of missions in the Mississippi Valley from Canada to New Orleans. For the missionaries, Marie becoming a nun represented the apex of their missionary goals. Yet for Marie, as a mixed French Indigenous woman, her education and decision to become a nun allowed her to transverse a complex hybrid world as an active agent in shaping her own destiny. For Marie, the convent was a representational space in which women religious were perceived in specific ways, given the social, gendered, religious, political, and racialized constructs in which that space was constructed. When Marie entered that space, her perception of herself as an Illinois woman who was also a French woman, religious, was lived in ways that radically altered the spaces of what it meant to be French, Illinois, a religious sister, and educated. Today, the Ursuline Academy on State Street in New Orleans is the oldest continuous education for women in the US. So just a brief overview of the book. The story of Marie Turpin challenges dominant narratives of the history of education in the United States, in which the Anglo-Protestant Northern Common School movement holds a privileged position as the originator of public education. Alternatively, what I suggest and what emerges in my book is a complex bricolage of the processes of creolization in which the right to be understood as an educated subject, an emerging marker of one's humanity, was forged in a complex, multilingual, multiracial, transatlantic circuit. For these constellations of people, mutual recognition and entanglement was an unprecedented process of creolization that Edouard Glissant describes as an active, affirmative principle of cultural heterogeneity and innovation, what I call a rogue curriculum. Reimagining the educated citizen is situated at the margins of empire, both the French and Spanish colonies. The transatlantic Gulf South, where indigenous, African and French, as well as German colonists, indentured servants, enslaved peoples, both African and indigenous, free people of color, casket girls, prostitutes, sailors, pirates, and exiles negotiated their everyday lives through and in the spaces of emerging notions of the nation state and its corollary, the educated subject citizen. Situating education within the complex, fluid processes of these transatlantic circulations means there is no grand narrative of education that emanated from Europe, transported to the New World. Microhistories in this book are not limited to individuals or even traditional schools, but also include sites of education traditionally excluded from educational history: convents, Masonic lodges, benevolent societies, confraternities, as well as events and texts. My use of microhistories is shaped by Michel de Certeau's concept of history as an everyday practice, or how subjectivities are enacted through the deployment of available, circulating, and contradictory meanings. Meanings operate not on the level of code or structure, but on the acts of ordinary language use, wanderings, doings, makings that construct the world through continual and practical creation and recreation over time. History becomes not a form of representation, an object or a subject, but instead is an ethical, relational practice between what Henry Lefebvre calls representational spaces and representations of space and their links to social practices. The actors in this book are understood as active meaning makers in the production of history. Given this agency, traditional binaries of colonizer and colonized, oppressor and oppressed are simplistic reductions that obscure the complexities of cultural exchanges. Resituating American educational history within the complex, circulating, vibrant nexus of the transatlantic world is a long overdue project, given the intellectual, geographic, and cultural provincialism of the history of education. Practicing a history of education requires a deployment of history that first engages history as a relational, ethical, spatial practice, no longer bound by borders, boundaries, and the nation state. Secondly, that complicates the hegemonic narrative of an Anglo-Protestant American history in which educational theories are rooted in Reformed Protestantism and classical republicanism. Thirdly, provides a genealogy of what makes possible and intelligible the constructs of modern schooling. And lastly, that historicizes the spatial, cultural, social, and religious discourses that have made real constructs of the educated citizen, public education, and a technocratic curriculum. This book begins in 1685 with the French Code Noir, or the Slave Code, in which the enslaved, and in fact all subjects of the French Empire were guaranteed certain rights, including a Catholic education that provided access to the spaces of churches, catechism classes, confraternities, and schools, the most public institutions in French colonial America. It ends with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, with the end of public rights and racial segregation being imposed on every aspect of American life. I bracket this book between 1685 and 1896 to punctuate the long history of the relationship between the constructs of public rights, the educated citizen, and human equality embodied by generations of transatlantic activists in the Gulf South who shared a radical egalitarian vision anchored in public rights. So just a brief overview of the book. Chapter 1 describes the educational encounters between Indigenous peoples and Jesuit and Ursuline missionaries in New France as part of their effort to create a universal system of education. Again, rather than reduce these relationships to one of colonizer and colonized, I view these encounters through a Creole pedagogy of transcultural translation. These encounters are viewed through a Creole pedagogy in which cross-cultural interactions resulted in complex, multidimensional processes that inevitably resulted in the transformation of all those involved. The chapter really looks at 4 transatlantic spaces: early Jesuit missionary activity in Canada, the missionary work of Maria of the Incarnation, who founded the first Ursuline convent in 1639. And there was also a convent later, after New Orleans, or before New Orleans, in Martinique, and then after New Orleans in India. So the Ursulines really were a global entity. The second space that I look at is the Illinois Jesuit mission in Kaskaskia, from which Marie Turpin traveled. And lastly, I look at the missionary work through his journal of Father Paul Deroux, the first Jesuit missionary in Louisiana in 1700. Given the racial fluidity of the time, the pedagogical spaces reveal the complex identity transformations in which Indigenous persons become Frenchified, as well as the ways in which the French were transformed by Indigenous culture. Chapter 2 focuses on the Ursuline French teaching order in New Orleans, whose academy opened in 1727, initially with the mission to educate Indigenous girls, but later, when slavery was introduced into Louisiana, of course, it was all races, African included. But their mission was to educate girls of all races, classes, and ethnicities. The chapter examines the production of transatlantic educated subjects at the Ursuline convent as a transgressive Creole pedagogy of disorder, in which the spatial constructs of the convent between 1736 and 1752 illuminate the complex networks of relationships among French, both teachers or nuns and students, African enslaved and also free students of color, and Indigenous peoples, students, and in the case of Marie, Aquierna. Given the Ursulines' female-centered spirituality in which women and mothers were understood as teachers, this reconfiguration of 17th century, 18th century gender norms pushed the limits of colonial and ecclesiastical policies, creating ruptures in the social, racial, and gender norms of colonial policy. For the enslaved Africans and Indigenous peoples who lived in the convent walls, they appropriated, adapted, and resisted these pedagogical spaces to not only leverage as many rights and freedoms as they could, but also to reestablish and maintain their own African and Indigenous cultural systems. However flawed or limited the Ursuline vision certainly was, it contributed to establishing an Afro-Creole protest tradition that appropriated the Catholic doctrine of universal rights to fashion themselves as active agents in claiming their humanity. Chapter 3 focuses on how the reverberations of the Haitian Revolution and its promise of racial equality sent shockwaves through the United States, contributing to the production of the white citizen embodied in the Common School movement. Haitian refugees to New Orleans in 1810 doubled the population of the city, resulting in 65% of the residents being either enslaved Africans or free people of color. 65%. Anticipating freedom and full citizenship in this era of the revolutionary Atlantic world, public education was understood by many as critical to freedom and democratic revolution. This chapter chronicles the attempts to establish interracial public education in New Orleans well before the 1840s Common School movement. Specifically, it examines the Collège d'Orléans, founded in 1811, the integrated St. Claude School for colored and white girls, founded in 1824, and the founding of the Sisters of the Holy Family, the second order of African-American women religious, and their Bayou Road School. These attempts at interracial public education brought a unique diasporic, multilingual, multinational, and multi-ethnic cultural identity to bear on the ways they imagined freedom, citizenship, democracy, and their corollary education. Undergirding these attempts was a commitment to signifying a common humanity through universal education. Chapter 4 highlights how a Creole pedagogy of imagination was engaged by Afro-Creoles and other disenfranchised groups in counter-public spaces, including schools, Masonic lodges, literary associations, and benevolent societies, to envision freedom in the increasingly repressive years leading up to the Civil War. Unlike the institution building prior to 1841, which sought to create interracial spaces, the institutions after 1841, when New Orleans public schools were mandated as white only, the institutions after 1841 were out of necessity segregated. These counter-public spaces that emerged among free people of color, enslaved Africans, and French emigres in New Orleans to contest the racialization of education were developed in response to ideologies of white supremacy that were increasingly fueled by the constructs of scientific racism. Specifically, the chapter examines the L'Institution Catholique de Orphelines d'un Indigence, the Catholic Institute, as it's known more commonly, which was a public school for free people of color in New Orleans, founded by a formerly enslaved African-American woman, Marie Couvent, and Libby's research has looked at this in great depth. But the Catholic Institute was considered to be the nursery of revolution in New Orleans, and students were educated in becoming public activists. Another entity or counter-public space that I look at in this chapter is the Perseverance Lodge number 4, which was initially an interracial Masonic lodge, and the Turnvereins, which were the German educational societies. And I look at these as counter-public spaces that fostered political activities that allowed the disenfranchised to claim their political subjectivity despite their racial and ethnic subordination. Chapter 5 looks at the interracial coalition of radical activists, including Louis-Charles Roudenez, Paul Trevin, Jean-Charles Husseau, who was from Belgium, Rudolph Desdunes, and Louis Martinet. Many of them were involved in starting the New Orleans Tribune, which was the first African-American daily newspaper in the United States and was bilingual. And also the second newspaper I look at is the Crusader, the mouthpiece of the Citizens Committee that organized the legal challenge to racial segregation, resulting in the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. For both newspapers, segregation, especially in public schools, would always be a mark of inferiority and would create a caste system that was antithetical to the public rights they saw as critical to the equality promised by American democracy. These interracial, community-based texts were neither Black or white spaces, but liminal spaces, thresholds between what was and what could be in a true democracy based on public rights. So just to conclude, the story in the book challenge the dominant narratives of educational history by situating Louisiana as part of a vibrant, dynamic, revolutionary Creole pedagogical circuit that challenged emerging constructs of race, democracy, and education. Ironically, the experiments in interracial democratic education came to an end to some degree in 1841 with the introduction of the Common School movement, in which public schools were established as whites only, marking the public sphere as a segregated space and constructing African Americans as non-citizens. Louisiana's educational history contests not only the story of the Common School movement as the origins of public education, but it situates Louisiana as part of the transatlantic world that produced counter-Enlightenment ideologies of citizenship, not bounded by nation, race, or the law, but in a philosophy of equal rights that is produced in public spaces, especially schools. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hendry, for your wonderful overview of your new book for us. And now I will turn it over to our first panelist, Dr. Cameron McCarthy.
I'm going to share what I have as a question. Let's see. Go back to Zoom. I'm sharing my share. And then here. Well, I found this book so extraordinary in terms of the depth of what I see as this engagement with post-colonial aesthetics and post-colonial theory. There's some kind of cross-dialogue here that's going on. Actually, the first time I sort of became aware of a certain kind of narrative around Haiti was reading Alejo Carpentier's Reino de este Mundo, the Kingdom of this World, which deals with Haiti's revolution. And in that text, you see the Haitian elite fleeing to Cuba and fleeing to Louisiana. But the question that I have at this moment, which I hope you can all see, let's click on it and make it fuller. And then I have to move these other images out of the way so I can read. Unleashing the curriculum history from the tropes, this is on page 5, of monumental narratives, the nation state, and the dominant languages of education will require a re-envisioning of, actually this is page 340, of educational history that takes seriously the powerful and essential role of imagination in creating the public sphere. The question I'm asking is, how methodologically does this book unleash curriculum history from Petra, what you're calling monumental narratives? It reminds me a lot of Renato Rosaldo's Culture and Truth, in which he talks about monumentalism. What would you say are the main methodological innovations of the book, read against sort of what we might call a kind of mainstream histories or whatever, however you want? And could art and aesthetics, novels, paintings, as they do play a role in Lisa Lowe's The Intimacies of Four Continents, do you see a methodological role for looking at these things? And then I'm asking this question because I find myself as a scholar writing about post-colonial art, paintings, plays, novels, in great sympathy with the approach in this book.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that very thoughtful question. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it in the given parameters here, but it's certainly going to give me a lot to think about. And I'm not familiar with Lisa Lowe's book, so I'll have to add that to my growing list of books to read in retirement. I think methodologically, and I am reluctant to use that word method, since I think it is part of sort of the project of colonialism. So the forms of inquiry that I engaged in writing the book were really those of trying to bring new theoretical, I think, constructs to bear on the way that we look at education. So again, using a transatlantic lens that again, I think provides a much more a larger scope from which to understand the complexities of the exchanges, human relationships. Also, I think bringing creolization theory, which I see as very much a Caribbean way of, or Caribbean way and theory to approach and deconstruct again the construct of the nation state. There were, and again, looking historically, the nation state is emerging during this time, and there's just a much greater sense of fluidity and movement and crossing of boundaries that is going on. And I think we tend to read history backward from the viewpoint of the nation state, and that is what David Scott talks about in his book Conscripts of Modernity, and that concept that we really have to let go of some of those again monumental narratives or constructs and conscripts that constrain or limit how we see what's going on in the day-to-day everyday practices. And I think again in terms of a form of inquiry, again, I drew heavily on Michel de Certeau's notion of history as everyday practice, that we cannot write a history of education, that there are multiple histories and they are continually changing and shifting as we continue to understand and to re-envision or re-see things from different perspectives. As far as the art and aesthetics, there's one section of the book where I tried to do that. This is not my area, but when I looked at the Ursuline convent and their use of music as a pedagogy, and the ways in which that was then also appropriated by Africans. And there was a blending, I think, of some of that European beat with African beat at Congo Square that then eventually, of course, became jazz, blues. So I wish I was more astute at looking at sort of the arts and aesthetics, but that is not my forte. So, but I think that there's a lot there.
If I could have one just follow up, because I really, what I think precisely you share with post-colonial theorists is a sort of rereading of center-periphery relations, of sort of reading back and forth between different sites. C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, which is about the Haitian Revolution. He reads between France and Port-au-Prince in Haiti. In Lisa Lowe's book, she's sort of reading the documents that are held in France, that are held in the so-called Museum of Man in London, personal correspondence of political leaders and policymakers and officials of the East India Company and the West India Company to show this sort of extraordinary relationship between and among these different entities in Asia, in the New World, and Africa, etc. So there's, I think, quite an echo in this text of that kind of way of kind of lacing histories. And as a kind of a final thought, I was thinking, since this question also introduces the issue of space and how you read space historically and how you read space specifically into education, of whether, because a lot seems to focus in New Orleans and what is happening in whether the city, like say an island, is also kind of a space of porosity where there's constant absorption and expulsion, and that is the play of history in these specific contexts, or rather, really, all history is diasporic.
Yeah.
And that what we have at work, particularly as we read it out in terms of racial lines of distinction and gender lines of distinction, is a sort of disavowal that is made more necessary and more urgent because of the intimacies that actually exist about peoples. And I think your book in many ways demonstrates that kind of enlacement.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I think I should stop sharing now, right? So that others can proceed.
Thank you very much for the intriguing conversation. And now I want to welcome Dr. Ng-A-Fook as our second panelist.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here on the unceded, unsurrendered ancestral territories of the Algonquin people at the University of Ottawa. Hi, Petra.
Hello.
Hi. So, look, a little improvisation here in terms of just thinking through your work and just seeing everyone who's joined us today. So when I saw Cameron join and was going to participate, I thought of Toward Curriculum Identities and your piece Engendering Curriculum History. It was one of the first pieces that I read as a grad student, and you could really see you working out, if you want to say, curriculum theorizing in the making, or the making of curriculum theorizing. I see Janet there as well. So in terms of her work and that concept in her work of anytime I have students that say they want to think through post-structuralism, say if you want to read a piece where you see someone doing post-structuralism in terms of thinking through that, you need to read Petra's work in that chapter, and then later the book. But for me, in this book, I really saw, Petra, a lot of your earlier work, like Subject to Fiction, Pedagogies of Resistance, Julian of Norwich in terms of thinking about mysticism. I saw The Ghost of William Dahl and perhaps those conversations through. A lot of the earlier work in terms of what I would say you developing your own sensibility around curriculum theorizing and experimenting with it in terms of different micro contexts, bringing it together as a collective here and really applying it to this larger project that at the same time takes up these micro lived histories that you talk about in relation to these macro contexts. So it's just so amazing. And I used to ask when I was a student, and I still see myself as a student, when I was a student in Deborah Britzman's class, I'd say, how did you write this book? How did you put it together? When I was a student in Bill's class and I read Understanding Curriculum, how did you put this book together? And I'm reading this book and I'm like, Petra, how did you put this book together? It's just it's a really a piece of art and a beauty. You can see a beautiful labor of love in terms of your work. And so I just a quick quote, and then I have a question for you. You say, I wrote this book. This relational history required me to read and interpret history through space and time to look for the connections and ruptures that have made a difference, as opposed to reading for progress. I looked for spatial shifts that imploded fixed boundaries of identity, nation, citizenship, freedom, and in what it means to be educated and fully human. These slippages represent not another different subaltern truth, but instead function to suspend history as a relational web so entangled that it cannot be untethered. And it's in the section Practicing History, Walking the Streets. And so I was wondering, in terms of your everyday lived practice, in terms of the work that you did trying to assemble this kind of like these narrative montages, where I'm interested in the ingredients and how you put that together. So I'm going to ask that question again, like, how did you write this book? So I'm really interested in like the walking, like, where did you go to visit and what did you learn through visiting those different sites, like whether it was in Quebec or in New Orleans or elsewhere. And then when you were visiting those sites, how did you decide to pick and choose what you might keep or record to then later consult, read, to assemble the montage that you have in terms of the different narratives, right? So that's part of it. I'm really interested in your intersubjective relation in terms of doing that. And then later on, you talk about transcultural, and I wonder the implications for you in terms of your intersubjective transcultural exchanges in doing that work in relation to then putting it together as a book.
Wow. That sounds like a whole nother book.
That's the behind the scenes footnotes, but I would love to get like a glimpse into to that story.
Well, it was a very complicated process that I started working on in the early 2000s. And it began with, doing some research on the Ursulines here in New Orleans, because when I realized that was the oldest continuous history for women in the United States, and I considered myself a pretty good historian of education, that was not on my radar screen. And I have to say that almost all of the work that I did has been collaborative in some way. I could not have done the work on the Ursulines or the Sisters of the Holy Family without Donna Porch-Freelo, who's here. We visited the archives many times together, trying to understand those New Orleans archives. Looking at the documents, trying to tease out what the race of the young girls was who were going to the Ursuline Academy, trying to envision what their experiences were like, trying to understand what the dominant constructs of class and race meant in that time period and for the Ursulines. And there's no way that we will ever know that. And one of the things that I certainly learned, and I borrow this term from Elizabeth Shirley, is that the archive is not a shrine. Much of the work, the archival work that I did, was a process of trying to listen to the echoes and the reverberations of the voices that were not there. The archives, although I love the musty smell of the archives and coming across, nuggets of things. They are bits and pieces that have been carefully selected that represent such a sliver, such a narrow story of any time period. But I did do a lot of archival work, both in New Orleans, in France and Paris, at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and at the National Archives, as well as in Aix-en-Provence. But probably one of the things that helped me the most was doing exactly what Disserto said, and that was to walk the spaces. I was able to get a grant in 2009-10, an Atlas grant, which paid for a year's leave and for me to spend 6 weeks in France. And what I did was go to try to locate each one of the convents from which the original 12 sisters came from. And I get goosebumps thinking about it now because some of those convents or pieces of them are still there. I visited with a sister in Paris who has written one of the definitive books on the Ursulines, and she showed me the remaining stones of the Ursuline convent in Paris. And we walked the parameters of that space. And in the National Archives, I was able to see the inventory list then of what was in that convent as a result of during the French Revolution, they confiscated all of the property in there and they left a list of everything, which included a list of their books. I was able to see also in the archives in Paris, the floor plans of the Ursuline convents, which allowed me to see the space that was dedicated to the libraries that they set up. Mm-hmm. That's where space really became important for me on a micro level, and being able to see the amount of space that was dedicated to the libraries, the number of books, the names of the books, the kinds of books, gave me a sense of the intellectual curiosity and power of these women. These were not docile, submissive nuns. They had a vision for how they thought the world should work. And I might not agree with it, but they had a vision. And tracing the steps that these nuns took to come to Louisiana and visiting those convents was a very powerful experience for me. To sit in the spaces where they had sat just made it so much more real. So I also, of course, in Quebec, the Ursuline convent is still there. There's the museum there, the grounds. I tried to go to as many of these spaces physically as possible and sit there to try and imagine, again, as Cameron was pointing out, the power of imagination, to imagine what their lives would have been. So a lot of the book comes out of my imagination, out of being in these spaces. And then those spaces would raise questions for me, and I would have to go back to the books or to the archives. So it was a very dialectical process. And again, I have to thank Libby. We spent a lot of time in the archives as well as in New Orleans, trying to trace the early Haitian refugees and their role, especially the, who became teachers and the kinds of schools. It's very difficult, time-consuming work that really, it's never done alone. And so I'm so thankful for the relationships that I've developed, with other scholars. Did that get at any part of your?
No, it did. And I like in terms of your own intersubjective, I was also thinking about the transcultural, and I wondered, like, just to follow up real quickly on in terms of the spatial time space, I wondered, like, I was thinking of Marie, like, if you were on a boat or traveled by water instead of land, how that might impact the kind of conceptualization of your own intersubjectivity, and just in terms of traveling time space. But also, like, I was just curious because you talk about that the interplay in terms of and to recognize the interplay of the transcultural exchanges, but so you need to as the author kind of narrate and create that world for us, but I was wondering, you as the author, what you went through in terms of that the transcultural exchanges that you experienced by visiting those sites as well, both physically but then also intellectually in terms of going through that work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, to go back to Marie Turpin, I did go to Kaskaskia, actually on my way to the University of Illinois to the qualitative conference in 2013. And I spent a week in Kaskaskia, again, just sitting, breathing the air there, looking at the remaining houses that are there, the architecture that's used. I was awestruck when I saw the first house in Kaskaskia because I felt I was in New Orleans.
Really?
Yeah, and Marie would have gotten on a flatboat, probably navigated by a free African who had probably navigated the waters of the Senegal River. Most of the people who navigated the boats down the river were African, often free African men of color. Who had the skills to navigate the Mississippi because they had done so in Senegal. So I imagined Marie stepping off the shores of the Mississippi River onto a boat and meeting, and being taken down river, which only took about 2 weeks. I mean, it was so fast. I mean, and you realize then, although these distances seem quite long and we think, oh, well, there were no highways or, the river was a massive highway that connected people from New Orleans to Kaskaskia to Quebec and to Chicago. Yeah. And this was a very fluid, very busy site of travel and exchange and gossip, and people knew what was going on within a few days. If something happened in New Orleans, people would know about it in the upper Louisiana, in Illinois, within a week or two. So this was not as remote as one would think. And that allowed me to realize, again, getting to the transcultural, how intimately people were involved with just such a wide spectrum, of people, and lived with them, and on an intimate basis. When you live with somebody for 2 weeks on a flatboat, those exchanges with the people on that boat are going to change your view of the world and your understanding of yourself in relation to the world. And so I see Marie coming into New Orleans knowing what she wanted to do. That she wanted to occupy that space and say, this is also my Illinois space. This is also a space for, and there's other scholars who would disagree with my interpretation, who see her very much as having been discriminated against because she was Native American. And that's why she entered, the Ursuline convent, not as a full nun, but as a converse nun. So there's multiple interpretations. As I said, they're going to continue to change.
Well, thanks, Petra. And again, I just want to reiterate, I think the book's so important because up here, even in Canada, and teaching history in terms of these macro standardized kind of mythologized narratives, and what your book does is it, through these micro histories, it really challenges, it juxtaposes the complexity of how complex things were. Like it's not just one single story as you've done. So thank you again for writing the book.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the inspirational conversation. Especially thank you for inviting us to sit and imagine with Dr. Hendry about the spaces. So now I want to welcome Dr. Neidenbach and as our third panelist today.
Okay, just sharing my screen here. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
I think eventually it'll become full screen. There we go. All right. So hi Petra. Hi everyone.
Hi.
I'm gonna kind of bring us back to maybe your argument here in this book and think about it through one of the specific stories. So I picked a passage on page 228 in the blue up here. Given the formation of the Sisters of the Holy Family and the Bayou Road School in 1842, their story compels us to ask why their educational activism has been eclipsed by the dominant narrative of education in New Orleans as beginning with so-called public education, white only, in 1841. These two events cannot be seen as separate parallel histories, but must be acknowledged as deeply implicated and intertwined. Elevating public education in the history of Louisiana functions to obscure the long history of Afro-Franco-Catholic educational institution building in which the vision of interracialism was the norm. This is a history that was revolutionary in its quest for human equality, yet is still in the making. And so I chose this passage for a couple of reasons. First, I wanted to highlight the role of women, especially free women of color in this history, as you know, something that's very important to me. And I think you actually say a little bit earlier in this chapter, obscured in the traditional histories of antebellum New Orleans is the Afro-Creole female school teacher, principal, and nun.
Yeah.
And second, I think this passage gets at your main argument, that there is a significant transnational, multiracial Catholic universalism history of education in New Orleans that predates and challenges this common school narrative that starts the history of public education in the city in 1841 and really starts, kind of pins the start of African-American education in the South after the Civil War.
Right.
And finally, I liked how the passage ended with a nod to the future by pointing to the ongoing struggle to fulfill the ideals of human equality, citizenship, and freedom forged in the revolutionary Atlantic. So I know you mentioned Henriette DeLille, the Sisters of the Holy Family, and the Bayou Road School very briefly when you're going over the book. I don't know if you want to start with a little bit more about them, but then I wanted to ask you the question that you essentially posed in this paragraph, which is why do you think the Sisters of the Holy Family, the Bayou Road School, I would add here Marie Couvent and the Catholic Institute, but why has this long history of Afro-Franco-Catholic educational institution building been obscured?
You want me to do that one first and then we'll do the second one, or
Yeah.
you want to? Okay. Well, a great question. And as you point out, one of the things that I'm not sure I anticipated that I was going to learn as I engaged in this research was this very long history of the agency of women, and in particular Afro-Creole women, in forging a interracial education as a way to demand that they be seen as human beings. Education here to me is equivalent to acknowledging someone's humanity. And of course, one of the insidious ways in which racism was able to take form was to suggest that certain people are not educable. I mean, this is central to racism, and again, is a through line to, I think, education even today. And we saw this in the after effects of Katrina. Why has that educational institution building been obscured? In part because it challenges the progressive notion of race relations that culminates in the civil rights movement. As Donna and I were working on this, it just became clear to us that traditionally the civil rights movement is seen, and Brown versus Board of Education in '54, which of course made segregation illegal, and the civil rights movement are seen as the beginning of civil rights activism. Mm-hmm. What's been obscured is the history of public rights as a form of activism. With Plessy versus Ferguson, I would suggest that public rights no longer becomes the ideological foundation for public education and common spaces. Instead of public rights, we enter an era of civil and legal rights. And that changes the whole construct of how we think about rights as something that is, grounded in our humanity, in our equality as moral and educable people, versus what's in the law. And so I think in looking at the Afro-Franco-Creole Catholic educational institutions of women, it really extends this period that we call the civil rights back 150 years, and that the struggle to be understood as human has been ongoing, and that there wasn't just this narrative of slavery in which people were oppressed, which of course they were, but there were also so many kinds of resistance and ways in which enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, continued to create institutions that acknowledge their humanity. But I think it just unraveled sort of the well-trod monumental histories of American history, such as the Civil Rights Movement. And so,
Thanks.
and pardon me?
I was just going to say, I did not imagine that was where your answer was going to take us, but I'm so happy that you did, because I was torn. I really wanted to do a passage that talked about the Reconstruction era and the Civil Rights Movement during that period too. So I think you brought us there. To me, it's so essential for everyone to understand how those Creole activists understood integrated public education as this foundation for rebuilding the nation after the Civil War. And like thinking about imagination, what would our country look like if that had been actually achieved? So going there, my second question, how can a better understanding of this alternative or counter history of public education help us reimagine public education today?
Wow, that's a biggie. Well, in light of, and I think I, touch on this in a couple of chapters and in the conclusion, in light of the increasing privatization of schools, of charter schools, of private schools, right now in Louisiana, as we speak, our new governor is proposing educational savings accounts, which would put taxpayer dollars into individual hands to choose whatever school they wanted, so that all parents, including the wealthy, could take their own supposed tax money, their public money, and spend it wherever they want to. I see this as so detrimental to the notion of a public sphere and to a neoliberal, construction of the individual as the core identity in society, and an unraveling of any notion of the role of the public sphere in democracy and a common humanity, that we are all intertwined, we are all interconnected. What one of us does, impacts others, and that we have a common responsibility and need to have a commitment to our communal existence as an organic, living, breathing entity. And that was ideally what the notion of a public sphere and public rights was. And Rebecca Scott talks about this so eloquently in her books, this vernacular notion of public rights, and that the public sphere creates the space in which we can interact and see each other's humanity. And so I would hope that by seeing the power of this notion of public rights historically, that it could help people to rethink some of these concepts of education today in terms of charter schools. And of course, New Orleans, after Katrina, all of the public schools were closed. They were taken over by the state. There are no public schools in New Orleans. It is an all charter system now. So it's all part of a business industrial model for education, which is really profit driven and has nothing to do with education. What I would term is education.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So on the note of creating public sphere and seeing each other's humanity through rethinking about education. So and in the interest of time, so I hope to close today's session. And before I do that, I want to thank our author again, Dr. Hendry, for this very important book and all the wonderful discussions that we have had today. So thank you so much. And we will upload this video to Curriculum Studies in Canada YouTube channel. So bye-bye, everyone.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. It's a
Thank you
wonderful
all.
discussion.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Petra.
Thank you.
all. Thank
So
you.
great to see everyone. Goodbye.
Yes.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, Cameron.
We'll talk
Bye-bye.
soon, Petra.